The Gold from Horsehead Rock. Many horses, Tom and John drove their horses and rode as fast as possible to the old cabin. But their hope was not fulfilled. The girls had not returned. They had no choice but to keep on searching. Many Horses was an excellent tracker, and he quickly picked up those of the horse thieves and the girls. When the tracks turned northwest after a while, John said, "The boys wanted to cross Gold River." Many Horses agreed with him. They headed straight for the shallow crossing that Bibi and Tina had also discovered. Only locals and cowboys who drove their cattle through the river to the vast expanse of pasture land on the other side knew this place. When the three of them reached the spruce grove, Many Horses dismounted and carefully examined the trail. "Two of the girls stayed here," he explained. "It was Bibi and Tina. They were wearing riding boots. Lucy continued on foot." He pointed to the river. "Bibi and Tina hid here in the woods and took their horses with them, leaving Apache here before a man in cowboy boots came and fetched him." Tom and John considered his words for a while. John finally spoke. "I guess Lucy snuck up on them and was discovered. Bibi and Tina must have been hiding back here when one of the boys took Lucy's horse." Many Horses nodded. After he swung back into the saddle, they followed the tracks leading out of the woods until they reached the abandoned campground near the river. Many Horses eyed the large boulder that stood beside the remains of a campfire. Behind it, the grass had been flattened. "This is where Lucy lay and listened to the men," he said. "But she was discovered. Then the men rode on with Lucy, and Bibi and Tina took up pursuit." Many Horses said this in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, but Tom and John could see that he was worried about his granddaughter. With not a moment to waste, the three steered their horses into the river, and locating the tracks on the other side, urged the animals to hurry. At last, the rock formation appeared in the northwest. The men paused beside the same hill from which Bibi and Tina had spied on the ghost town. It was out of the question for John, with his broken arm, to sneak up on them, so he remained with the animals while Many Horses and Tom climbed to the crest, laying down at the top to scan the ghost town unnoticed. Neither the horse thieves nor the children could be seen, but 4 horses stood to one side of a dilapidated old shack, Bibi and Tina's quarter horses, Lucy's Apache, and a young Morgan. "The men captured Bibi and Tina," said Many Horses. He pointed to a trail which led down the hill and towards the shack. "Then one of the 2 rode off. The other one, who owns the Morgan, is in the shack watching the girls." "That's Billy's horse," Tom said in surprise. He told Many Horses that Billy was one of the cowboys who worked at Horsehead Ranch. 2 riders appeared on the other side of the hollow. One of them was riding an Arabian and dressed all in black. The other rode a pinto. They were too far away to recognize their faces, but that wasn't necessary. "The black rider must be Jim Smith," said Tom, "and the one with the pinto must be Clint, the other of our cowboys." "Clint and Billy are in cahoots with Jim Smith? Why? What on earth are they up to?" The men had reached the shack, then dismounted, tied up the horses, and entered. "I am about to find out," said Many Horses. But before Tom could say anything, he jumped up and started running. As Tom followed the old man with spellbound eyes, it occurred to him how, for his age, this old Shoshone warrior was remarkably fit in both mind and body. He breathed a sigh of relief when Many Horses reached the side wall of the cabin. From there, he crept to the front and peered through the window next to the door. Billy had stopped playing harmonica some time ago. Despite every attempt to fight his exhaustion, he had finally fallen asleep in his chair. Every now and then, Billy's tongue would sink to the back of his throat, interrupting his snore with a cough-like nasal eruption before returning to a steady purr. "Quick, Tina, untie me," whispered Bibi. Although Tina and Lucy were also tied at the ankles and wrists, Bibi was the only one who had her hands tied behind her back. Tina managed to free Bibi's ankles, but was interrupted by the patter of hooves. "Drats, they're coming already." Tina pushed herself back. Clint and Jim Smith would likely be standing in the doorway at any moment, so Tina gave up her attempt and sat down as before. Shadows appeared at the doorframe, followed by a loud knock upon the dried-out wood. Billy bolted up, startled, breaking a leg off his chair as he did so and fell to the floor. "Didn't I tell you to be careful?" Clint grumbled at him while Billy pulled himself up. But when Clint saw the girls still sitting there just as they'd been when he left, he smiled contentedly, then turned to the man standing behind him. There they are, boss, lined up like chickens on a stick. So we meet again, said Jim Smith, smirking coldly at the three girls. Let us go at once, Lucy replied firmly. I'm afraid, Jim Smith shrugged. I can't really do that. But they will be looking for us, cried Lucy, and sooner or later they will find us. Smart girl, nodded Jim Smith. But did you happen to notice the rock caves behind us? One of them goes deep, deep underground. And sorry, Princess, but no one will find you there. You're not taking us there? Tina asked, terrified. Indeed. And after that, I'll have a nice, quiet chat with many horses and Mr. Brown. Maybe even a coffee. I'm sure we'll find an agreement that will satisfy everyone, he smiled. You want to lock up the girls in a cave and blackmail Mr. Brown? Billy asked. You could see that he didn't agree with that. Blackmail? No, Billy. I only want to talk some sense into the man and make sure he listens carefully. I'm awfully sorry myself that I have to resort to such methods, but if Mr. Brown and many horses had been more reasonable from the beginning, we wouldn't all be yabbering about here in this lousy old shack, now would we? Bibi, Tina, and Lucy looked at each other in desperation. Being locked up alone in a dark cave frightened them, but the worst part was that many horses and Tom Brown would agree to all of Jim Smith's demands as soon as they knew that the girls were in trouble. Horsehead Rock would be sold, and many horses and his wonderful Appaloosas would lose their homes. Lucy tugged desperately at her ankles, then suddenly fixed her gaze on the broken window next to the door. Bibi and Tina followed and saw what had caught Lucy's attention, the weathered face of an American Indian, wearing a feather war bonnet. In the next moment, it disappeared again. Jim Smith, who hadn't noticed anything, nodded to Clint and Billy. Come on, boys, let's get them into the cave. Mr. Smith, Lucy suddenly said in a loud voice, I know you're after gold that's supposed to be at Horsehead Rock. Jim Smith beckoned Clint and Billy to wait. And if I was? He asked. I know where you can find gold. My grandfather showed me the place. Before the last great Shoshone chief, Washaki, moved with his tribe to the reservation, he took his gold to a cave in Horsehead Rock. A huge treasure of artifacts and gold nuggets is still hidden there today. Artifacts and gold nuggets, eh? Jim Smith repeated under his breath. His eyes widened. But I warn you, they say the spirit of Washaki still guards the treasure. He punishes anyone who tries to take it. Oh, really? Said Jim Smith. Well, I am terribly frightened of ghosts. He laughed sarcastically. Well then, Lucy said reluctantly, I can show you the place, but only if you release me and my friends immediately afterwards. Of course, replied Jim Smith, tossing Clint a quick sideways glance. You know I'm a man of honor. You can take my word for it. Bibi and Tina looked at each other questioningly. Why would Lucy tell that scoundrel such a secret? Or was it to trap the men? As they left the shack, the two friends snuck a few glances around the area. The Native American who had appeared at the window was Many Horses. This much they knew. He must still be close by, they thought. Perhaps he was hiding behind the old shelter. Let's go, boys, cried Jim Smith as he swung himself up on his Arabian. We're going for the gold at Horsehead Rock. The Owl Calls. They rode back the way they had come along the Gold River. Clint and Jim Smith made sure that the girls could not ride side by side unobserved. Only once had Lucy whispered to the two friends, We have to buy some time. Since then, Bibi and Tina had been trying to make the ride longer. Again and again they complained about thirst or exhaustion and demanded a break. Even though they exaggerated quite a bit, the ride really was uncomfortable. Their hands were tied together, and even Bibi's arms were still tied behind her back. At some point, Jim Smith's patience wore thin. Don't be so sensitive, he said. We're not here for a picnic. We can't ride faster with our hands tied, Mr. Smith, Tina said with an innocent expression. We're afraid we'll fall off the horse otherwise, aren't we, Bibi? Bibi nodded. Yes, we're really sorry. We're not used to being on horses. Jim Smith sighed. Since he had no clue that Bibi and Tina were, in fact, excellent riders, he had to accept that they were only making slow progress. It was late afternoon when they had reached the crossing. Bibi and Tina's thoughts raced as they continued across the prairie at walking pace. Lucy wanted to gain time. But why? What plan did she have? There was nothing to be seen of many horses, who had been listening in on everything. The sun was already hanging low in the far west when they finally reached Horsehead Rock. "Well, where is the cave?" Jim Smith demanded impatiently. Lucy explained that they had to ride around the back of the rock to find the entrance. Jim Smith looked at her suspiciously. "Don't try any tricks, miss," he said threateningly. "No tricks," Lucy replied calmly as they rode to the back. Lucy pointed to an opening in the rock face. It was about the height of an average-sized man, the bottom of which was positioned about 4 horses high. "That is the entrance to the cave," she said, pointing upwards with her chin. "And how in the heck are we going to get up there?" Jim Smith asked. "There is a path leading up, but it is narrow and very steep, and in some places you have to climb," Lucy replied. "It will be dark soon, so maybe it's better to camp here for the night." "I'll be the one to decide that," Jim Smith replied sharply, "and I don't want to lose any time." "We don't want that either," said Lucy. "After all, we want to be released as soon as possible, but if we go up now, it's much too dangerous. I suggest waiting until sunrise." "All right, whatever," Jim Smith relented. "We'll stay here and climb up the rock tomorrow morning." After they found a place to camp, they tied the horses so that they could graze but not escape. Billy made a campfire and cooked beans in an old dented tin pot. Although this wasn't Bibi's favorite dish, she found the smell irresistible. She was famished, just like Tina and Lucy. After all, they hadn't eaten all day. When the beans were ready, Billy made sure that the girls also got some. Tina and Lucy were able to eat in spite of their hands being bound. Bill made one arm free for Bibi so that she could also eat, but not perform any magic. Darkness set in quickly, and the men decided to take turns keeping watch. Billy took the first shift, while Clint and Jim Smith stretched out around the campfire and fell asleep immediately. Bibi leaned back against the tree trunk to which her arms were fastened. Lucy and Tina had it a touch more comfortable, seeing as how they could at least lie down. Billy had offered them horse blankets, and also tucked one around Bibi. A "ooh, ooh" suddenly cut through the nighttime stillness. "Ooh, ooh, ooh, ooh." Bibi was startled. Tina and Lucy sat up. "Ooh," came the sound again. "Ooh, ooh." Bibi got goosebumps, even though it was only the call of an owl. "That's grandfather," whispered Lucy. "He is very close. Tomorrow in the cave he will free us." Billy, who stood guard only a stone's throw away, did not move. Either he hadn't heard anything, or he didn't care what the girls whispered to each other. He certainly hadn't understood Lucy's words. She had spoken too softly for that. Nevertheless, the 3 of them preferred to keep silent now. Only the fire cracked occasionally before dying down to low-lit embers. Then there was silence. All would be decided tomorrow, Bibi thought, in the cave at Horsehead Rock. She looked up at the black silhouette that towered above them, then craned her neck towards the heavens and caught sight of a single, fiery shooting star. Moments later, lulled by the flickering light of a billion more, she closed her eyes and nodded off. Visitors in the night. Sheriff Sullivan had closed the office right to the minute and shuffled up to the top floor where his apartment was located. He plopped down in front of the television with a microwave dinner and used the remote to turn it on. An old western was playing. A calico cat jumped into his lap, and Frank Sullivan stroked her fondly as he watched the movie. It was about a sheriff who caught a young, murdering outlaw from the East Coast. "Luckily, things are a little quieter around here, aren't they, Lizzie?" he growled contentedly. He remembered how Ellie Brown had called him that afternoon. She had been terribly worked up as she told him a confusing story about 2 girls who were guests at her ranch, one of whom was a witch, and along with the granddaughter of many horses, had been pursuing horse thieves. Since then, they had disappeared. Frank Sullivan had to smile. "Now that was quite a wild story, wasn't it, little kittykins?" he said to his cat. Lizzie purred loudly and shoved her snout against the sheriff's hand. Even his cat didn't seem to take the matter too seriously. When Sheriff Sullivan questioned Ellie, it turned out that no horses had been stolen. Consequently, there were no horse thieves. Frank Sullivan had managed to calm Ellie down by telling her that the children had probably gone out for a ride, lost track of time, and would certainly be back soon. He at last assured her that if the children still hadn't shown up the next day, she should contact him again. Then he hung up. Frank Sullivan washed his face, brushed his teeth, and crawled into bed. He was awoken in the middle of the night by a loud clang. When he switched on his bedside lamp, he saw a plum-sized stone laying in front of his bed. It had flown in through the window, he gathered. Only splinters of glass now hung from the frame, and the floor was covered in shards. "Who in the name of—" Furious, Frank Sullivan jumped out of bed, put on his slippers, and looked out. Ellie and John Brown stood under the streetlight in front of his apartment, and Ellie already had a new rock in her hand. "You must be missing half a brain to go and smash my window," Frank Sullivan yelled. "We knocked on your door before," hollered John Brown, "but you didn't wake up." "Why should I wake up?" Frank Sullivan barked. "It's the middle of the night." "Because a crime has been committed," cried Ellie. "And if you don't come right now, I'm going to throw this second rock at your head." "A crime?" Frank Sullivan leaned out the window. Did he hear what he thought he heard? "Yes, a crime," John Brown called back. "We'll tell you all about it in the car. Let's go and take some handcuffs with you." Only now did the sheriff notice the Browns' old station wagon parked by the side of the road with the engine still running. Had something really happened? Frank Sullivan knew Ellie and John as law-abiding citizens. If they broke a window, it must have been for a serious reason. "I'm coming," he shouted. 2 minutes later, Sheriff Sullivan stormed down the stairs and into the car. The dove-blue station wagon roared away at breakneck speed. A reddish glow lay over the horizon. Soon, the sun would rise. Decision in the cave. Jim Smith woke up the girls at sunrise. "Get up, here we go," he commanded. On his order, Clint cut through their bindings so they could climb. "Don't get any ideas," Clint hissed. "I am right behind you," he grinned maliciously. "Don't even think about using magic or any of that other hocus-pocus." Bibi got goosebumps. This guy could do anything, she thought. Her eyes fell involuntarily on the revolver holster that hung around his waist. The group began their ascent. Lucy had to go first, with Jim Smith and Billy following behind her. Then came Bibi and Tina. Clint was the last in line. They finally made it. The cave entrance opened in front of them like a voluminous stone mouth. Clint tied the children's hands again, and Jim switched on a flashlight he'd taken with him. "Let's go," he ordered. A narrow, dark passage led deep into the belly of Horsehead Rock. They'd walked less than a minute before the entire group was enshrouded in darkness. Only the flashlight cast its eerie beam against the surface. Lucy led them even further inwards. The path was wet and slippery in places, and the girls had to be extra careful to maintain their footing. The route forked in different directions on several occasions. Bibi and Tina felt completely disoriented, while Lucy didn't seem to doubt for a moment which way was the right one. If not for her, they would never find their way out again. Jim Smith must have had a similar thought. "Do you know where you're taking us?" he asked Lucy suspiciously. "Of course," Lucy replied with confidence. "We're almost there." Indeed, shortly after this exchange, they entered a large underground hall. It was circular and spacious enough to fit 100 adults comfortably. Above them was a small opening through which a faint beam of light penetrated. It fell directly onto a smooth, rectangular boulder in the middle of the room. The boulder was about the size of a small kitchen table, and on top of it, "There's one!" shouted Clint in amazement. Indeed, a motionless figure stood atop the rock. It wore feather ornaments on its head and clutched a bow in its hand. A Native American. The figure appeared to be some sort of statue, but then emitted a deep, authoritative voice as if speaking directly from the afterlife. "I am the spirit of Washaki, the last chief of the Shoshone," it echoed through the room. "Guardian of my brother's treasure. The pale faces have come to take what is not theirs. This they shall not." His words bounced off the surrounding walls. "They shall not. They shall not. They shall not." It's Ghost!" Clint stuttered meekly. "Nonsense." Jim Smith was not easily intimidated. "Ghosts are not afraid of bullets. Show him your gun and we'll see if it's a ghost." But Clint didn't get a chance to draw. The figure raised his bow and shot an arrow through the air, knocking Jim's flashlight straight out of his hand. It landed with a muffled clack on the damp ground and went out, bathing them all in a gloomy twilight. The faint beam from the cave ceiling was not enough to illuminate the hall. "Find the flashlight," Jim shouted. He and Clint dropped down on all fours to look for it. Bibi felt a hand grab her shoulder. Then she was pulled behind a boulder. "It's me, Tom," she heard him whisper as Tom got to work cutting the ties around her wrists. Bibi could finally move her arms again. "Quick, Bibi," whispered Tom. "You have to cast a spell for a treasure on the rock where many horses stood." Bibi quickly put the puzzle pieces together. The alleged ghost was many horses. Although witches were not allowed to cast a spell for money or gold, Bibi had an idea. She lifted her arms and whispered, "Eeny, meeny, cowboys confound, now spin their greedy heads around. Eeny, meeny, ancients have told that tin and brass trick fools for gold. Whiz, whiz." A pling, pling resounded, and sparkling stars drew a luminescent path through the darkness. In its glow, Jim Smith and Clint caught sight of the flashlight, and Jim grabbed it immediately. But before they could switch it on, something magical attracted their attention. Without it even occurring to them that Bibi may have cast a spell, the men stared transfixed at the rock where the figure had just stood. In his place, as if illuminated by an inner fire, lay a handsome heap of gold nuggets, shimmering mysteriously. "That's gold," Jim Smith gasped. "Gold! Gold!" Clint yelled. "Gold, gold, gold!" The two men were hypnotized by excitement and ran wildly towards the treasure. They seemed to have forgotten everything, not even noticing that Bibi had disappeared. Billy stopped. "That was magic," he shouted. "Didn't you see the little witch stars?" But Clint and Jim Smith paid him no attention. They lit the flashlight in front of the boulder and grabbed rapturously at the nuggets. "Gold! Gold!" they cheered. Nobody paid attention to Tina and Lucy either, who had retreated quietly to the edge of the underground hall. A figure appeared before them. "Grandfather," whispered Lucy in relief. Many horses cut their bonds. "Follow me," he whispered. He then led them carefully and quickly back through the passageway. Tom and Bibi were already waiting for them. "Let's get out of here," whispered Tom, "before they notice anything." Then they heard Billy's voice shouting, "The girls are gone!" Jim Smith knew immediately what this meant. Without Lucy, they would never find their way out of here. "Don't let them get away," he yelled. "We'll get the gold later." Many horses, Tom and the girls, gripped each other's hands as they ran down the pitch-black corridor. The hammering sound of boots behind them grew closer, and when Bibi turned around, she saw the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically across the walls. "Faster!" cried Many Horses, who was leading the small group and had now also noticed the men approaching. But he, the children, and Tom had to hold hands so as not to get lost. No matter how hard they ran, it didn't feel fast enough. Once again, Many Horses turned in a different direction, finding his way safely through the dark. They hurried on, hoping that the men would get lost in the forked corridors. "It's not far now," whispered Many Horses to them. "Soon we'll all be at the exit." Suddenly, Tina shrieked in pain. "No!" she sobbed. "My foot is stuck." The men had also heard the scream. "This way," Jim Smith commanded. The flickering light came closer and closer as Many Horses and Tom tried to free Tina's foot from a crevice in the rock. Finally, they succeeded. "Hands up," said Clint coldly. "Only the little witch keeps her hands nice and low." The flashlight beam glistened off the barrel of Clint's gun as he took aim. Many Horses, Tom, Lucy, and Tina raised their hands slowly, while Bibi didn't dare move. Jim Smith stepped forward and shook his head slightly. "I am so disappointed. You would have just let us sit down there." "That is not very nice of you," he pouted mockingly. "As a reminder of your sinister intentions, however, we will go ahead and do the same to you. But first you'll help us collect what's ours. Come on back, my friends." At that moment, Billy squeezed between the two men and stood right in front of Clint. "Put away your gun, Clint," he demanded. You don't point a gun at people, especially kids. Have you gone crazy, Billy? Hissed Clint. Get out of my way right now. No, Billy said resolutely. I won't do it. Tina recognized her chance and nudged Bibi. Quick, cast a spell. Bibi raised her arms. Eeny, meeny, metal and bone. Clint heard what she was about to do. She's gonna make magic, he roared. Out of the way, Billy, or you'll get it too. But Billy didn't budge. Once a revolver, now a stone. Whiz, whiz. As a pling-pling sounded and little stars sprayed, Clint found himself holding a fist-sized rock in his hand. Totally disgusted, he dropped it. When the stone hit the ground, Billy turned to Bibi and her friends and shouted, Run! Without looking back, they ran as fast as they could. The opening was soon in sight, a small, blindingly bright spot of light that grew larger with every step. Finally, they had made it. Once outside, the sunlight flooded their faces. Bibi turned around quickly and sang out, Eeny, meeny, danger abates, opening blocked with iron gates, whiz, whiz. As the pling-pling faded away and the witch stars disappeared, they knew they were safe at the sight of metal bars barricading the cave entrance. The men were trapped. For joy, the three girls sobbed and laughed at the same time while they held each other tightly. Then they hugged Many Horses and Tom. Suddenly, someone shouted from below, Hey, you two up there! Everything okay? Bibi and Tina could hardly believe their ears, but they knew that familiar voice. Yes, down there at the foot of Horsehead Rock were indeed John Brown and Ellie, waving up to them with relief. Next to them stood Sheriff Frank Sullivan. Confessions. A few hours later, they all sat together peacefully on the veranda at Horsehead Ranch. Bibi, Tina, Lucy, Many Horses, and John Brown. It was lunchtime. Ellie was in the house preparing the food, and Billy was helping her in the kitchen. Yes, lucky young Billy. After Bibi, Tina, and Lucy had told the sheriff how he had risked his life for them, Frank Sullivan had turned a blind eye and let him go. Unlike Jim Smith and Clint, Tom had just given the sheriff a ride back to town with his two prisoners. Sheriff Sullivan couldn't yet say exactly what type of punishment they were facing. At first, they would go to jail anyway, and then of course there would be a trial. On the way back from Horsehead Rock, he had only said, These awful guys are looking at a long time in prison. Now the rest were waiting for Tom to return so they could have lunch together. Ellie's mind was finally at ease knowing that the children were safe again. And now her only concern was making sure they had a delicious home-cooked meal. John, on the other hand, wanted to know exactly what had happened in the cave at Horsehead Rock. Shortly after Many Horses had returned from the ghost town cabin to their hideout on the hill, he had reported what was going on, and Tom's father had ridden back to get the sheriff. If the plan Many Horses came up with worked, they needed all the help they could get to put the crooks behind bars. Many Horses and Tom, on the other hand, had followed the children and their kidnappers to Horsehead Rock, where they knew how and where to hide. They had been so close to them during the night that Many Horses could communicate with Lucy by making owl calls. The girls took turns reporting what had happened in the cave. My goodness, how exciting, cried John Brown. How unfortunate that I wasn't there to see it all. When the girls had come out of the cave, Ellie and the sheriff had climbed up to meet them, Tom, and Many Horses. John had to stay down at the bottom of the rock with his injured arm, so he hadn't been able to follow all the action. And then what happened? He buzzed. It didn't take long, the girls continued, until Jim Smith, Clint, and Billy appeared at the barred cave exit. As soon as Jim Smith saw the sheriff, he pulled his most innocent face. Sheriff Sullivan, how good of you to come, he said. Please arrest these men immediately, he continued, pointing at Clint and Billy. Without batting an eyelid, he declared that they were behind all of the local shenanigans. They had tried to steal and sell Many Horses' Appaloosas, and after failing to do so, kidnapped the children to extort a ransom. Luckily, he himself had hunted them down and freed the children, although Clint had threatened him more than once with his revolver. Bibi, Tina, and Lucy looked at each other in bewilderment. How brazen this rascal was to concoct such a tale. Clint and Billy were also stunned, but Clint didn't hold his tongue for long. That's a big fat lie, he shouted angrily. It's really the boss's, Mr. Smith and Billy's fault. And now he explained that Jim Smith and Billy had kidnapped the children in order to blackmail many horses and John Brown. But he found out and freed the children. "You gotta arrest these scoundrels immediately, Sheriff," he said, pointing at Billy and Jim Smith. Incredulous, Billy had looked back and forth between Clint and Jim Smith. "And I thought you were my comrades," he said softly. Sheriff Sullivan had been completely overwhelmed. He just wasn't used to dealing with crooks like this. Bibi walked up right next to the grating and hissed at Clint and Jim Smith. "If you don't tell the truth right now, I'll turn you two into rattlesnakes." She raised her hands. "Eeny, meeny, rattle and fang, turn these scoundrels—" "No!" cried Clint and Jim Smith in unison. "Please don't. We'll confess everything." And so they did. Jim Smith even admitted to hiring a cheat to beat Billy at poker so that he'd lose his money, making it easier to hire him as part of the plan. Clint had been privy to everything and had persuaded Billy to play in the first place. He also confessed that he had rigged John Brown's girth, which had made him fall off the horse and break his arm. "Ha!" cried John triumphantly when he heard this. "I knew it! No way I'm too old to jump over fences on horseback." Tom soon returned. He had delivered the sheriff and his prisoners to Western Town and made sure Clint and Jim Smith were behind locked bars before he left. Meanwhile, the children's stomachs were rumbling. They all went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Ellie and Billy put out huge plates of sandwiches, salad, baked potatoes, and corn on the cob for the group to enjoy. Bibi, Tina, and Lucy's mouths were watering. Only Billy remained standing. He wiped his hands on his pants and said awkwardly, well, I'd best be leaving now." "Where are you going?" John asked, confused. After everything that's happened, I think I'd better move on and look for work somewhere else," Billy said, then added, "with all due respect." Ellie stood up once more, placed her hands on his shoulders and pushed him down into the last free chair. "That is out of the question, Billy. Or do you not like it here anymore?" "Yes, very much, ma'am, but—" John interrupted him with a decisive hand movement. "No buts, Billy. You risked your life to save those of others. You acted like a real cowboy. In 2 weeks, my cast will come off, and until then, I need all the help I can get around here. After that, I'll teach you everything a cowboy needs to know. I've already seen you've got a knack for horses." "Really?" Billy was beaming. "Why, heck yes! We need somebody like you on the ranch, and here you can earn an honest living. And I'll have someone to spoil a little," Ellie smiled. "You're staying with us, and that's final." Billy blushed with joy. Ellie looked around warmly at the others. "Enjoy your meal," she said, and everyone did. True friends. After dinner, Bibi and Tina asked if they could stay in the teepee again. Lucy was immediately thrilled by the idea, and many horses and the Browns didn't mind either. "All the bad guys in the area are in jail now," said John, "so hopefully nothing will happen this time." Shortly afterwards, Bibi and Tina rode off with Lucy and many horses. As they trotted leisurely across the prairie, Bibi and Tina kept looking over to many horses in admiration. With his leather jacket, feathered war bonnet, and bow and arrow over his shoulder, he looked quite impressive. Tina could now finally pose the question that had been bothering her the whole time. "Is there really gold in Horsehead Rock?" she asked. Many horses looked at her earnestly. "Who knows?" he replied. "Maybe Chief Washaki really has a treasure hidden in there." He paused. "But gold is dangerous," he went on. "Most people think they can buy anything they want with it. But what is really important, you cannot buy." Many horses smiled and remained silent. There was nothing more for him to say about gold. The cabin and ancestral teepee appeared in front of them as they approached Horsehead Rock. Lucy steadied Apache and stopped. "We three will ride on to Gold River," she said to her grandfather. Many horses didn't seem at all surprised by this. "All right," he answered. "But be back for dinner," he said. "There's—" "I know," Lucy interrupted him. "Stew, right?" "How did you know that?" many horses asked. Bibi and Tina giggled. Many horses raised a hand in farewell. "See you later," he said. "It's time for me to change." The girls watched him trot to his cabin before they rode on. When they finally reached the Shoshone Valley, The three girls sat on the banks of the Gold River while the horses grazed nearby. Although they had been here only 2 days before, it seemed like ages ago. So much had happened since then, and through the adventures they had shared together, it was as if they had known each other for a very long time. "Remember I told you about a horseback riding festival in 2 weeks?" Lucy suddenly asked. "Are you still here then?" "Sure," said Tina. "We're spending a whole month at the ranch. Why? Will you be at the festival?" Lucy asked. "At first, I thought you were just tourists." Lucy looked at them directly. "But you're not. You are true friends. Without your help, we would have lost Horsehead Rock and the horses' home. You have understood how important this place is for us, which is why I want you to celebrate and ride together during the festival, just like real Shoshone." "You mean we should also take part in the equestrian games?" Bibi asked. "But we don't know anything about that." "There are still 2 weeks left," said Lucy. "Until then, I'll teach you everything if you want to learn." Bibi and Tina first looked at each other and then at their new friend. They nearly cried. "Of course we want to," they shouted in unison. "Fine," said Lucy with a laugh. "We'll start tomorrow." "Does your grandfather agree with this?" Bibi asked. Lucy nodded. "Grandfather knew long ago that we would become friends," she said. "He even suggested that I invite you." Many Horses was really a gifted man, Bibi thought. Suddenly, she remembered what he had said about the gold. Friendship was one of those important things that gold could not buy. "We'll be happy to join the festival," Tina said. "But first we want to show you a riding game that we always do at home." "Which one?" asked Lucy curiously. "Oh," said Tina. "It's not particularly difficult, but it's great fun. It's called horseback racing." "I know that," cried Lucy enthusiastically, and immediately jumped up. "We Shoshone do that too." "Well, let's go," said Tina. The girls had already run to their horses, swung themselves on their backs, and rode off. Bibi shouted exuberantly, "Whoever's first at the cabin gets an extra portion of stew. On your marks, get set, go!" Rowdy shouts of "Hua!" and laughter rang out as the three friends broke into a full gallop across the prairie.